Part 1: The MC3 Executive Mindset. Before leaders can change communication, they must change the way they see communication. 1. The moment leadership loses control. Every global leader can recall a moment when something in the organization shifted. It was nothing dramatic, nothing that would warrant a crisis meeting or a board update. Sometimes it happens during an ordinary weekly call, sometimes in the quiet aftermath of an email, or in the space between two routine updates. The leader senses a subtle change in the organizational atmosphere, a feeling that the team is still moving, but no longer quite in the same direction. This moment is almost always quiet. Global misalignment rarely announces itself with upheaval. Instead, it enters the system the way fog rolls across a landscape, gradually, almost imperceptibly, blurring the edges before anyone notices the visibility is changing. Leaders are often the last to realize it, not because they are inattentive, but because the early signs of drift are emotional, not operational. Messages still get delivered. Meetings still take place. Reports still arrive on time. Everything continues to function, but something underneath begins to loosen. A senior executive once told me she first sensed misalignment not when a crisis erupted, but when a regional manager paused a little too long before answering a question on a call. The pause wasn't problematic in itself. What unsettled her was the sense that the team was interpreting her tone differently than she had intended. It was as though her words had traveled through a filter she did not recognize. At the time, she dismissed the feeling, assuming it was due to time zones, workload, or local stress. Only later did she realize that this tiny emotional crack marked the beginning of a much larger drift. Global communication does not usually break because something large happens. It breaks because something small happens repeatedly. A slightly cooler tone. A misunderstood word. A hesitation that goes unexplored. A message that sounds firmer than intended. A region that acts more slowly or more quickly than expected. None of these microsignals are significant on their own, but together they form the early stages of interpretive divergence, the moment when the organization quietly begins to fracture into parallel emotional realities. The most dangerous assumption in global leadership is believing that communication is primarily about information. Leaders spend enormous amounts of time ensuring their message is correct, the right data, the right instructions, the right strategic clarity. They assume that once the content is delivered, alignment will follow. But global communication does not operate through content alone. It operates through interpretation, and interpretation is shaped far more by emotion, tone, context, cultural background, and past experience than by the literal meaning of the words. In multicultural environments, the emotional layer of communication always lands before the logical layer. People do not listen to the content of the message first, they listen to its emotional climate. They listen for tone, for pressure, for perceived expectations, for subtle shifts in leadership temperament. Only after decoding the emotional signal do they process the information. This sequence happens so fast and so instinctively that most people are not aware it is occurring. Yet it shapes everything that follows. One executive I worked with learned this lesson during a period of organizational change. She believed she was communicating stability and direction, but her teams in different regions heard the same message in very different emotional tones. In Northern Europe, her calm, concise delivery was interpreted as confident control. In East Asia, the same calmness was interpreted as withdrawal, a sign that something more serious was happening behind the scenes. In North America, her brevity signaled urgency. In Latin America, it was seen as emotional distance. In her mind, she had delivered one coherent leadership message. In practice, 4 different emotional messages had been heard, each creating a different behavioral trajectory. This is the moment where leadership quietly loses control, when the emotional interpretation of the message no longer matches the leader's intention. It does not require a mistake. It does not require a crisis. It simply requires that different teams begin to inhabit different emotional versions of the same message. Once this happens, behavior diverges. Not abruptly, but slowly, subtly, a shift in how quickly teams respond, in how confidently they speak up, in how cautiously they interpret risk. The organization begins to move as though its compass has been quietly rotated by a few degrees. The danger is that leaders rarely see this shift in real time. They continue delivering messages, assuming clarity is intact, unaware that the meaning has already begun to drift. They believe alignment is strong because meetings still run smoothly. But smooth meetings often mask emotional divergence. Silence, for instance, is one of the most misread signals in global communication. Leaders frequently interpret silence as agreement, when silence is often emotional, a hesitation, a protection, a pause driven by uncertainty or cultural instinct. Silence is not the absence of communication, it is communication shaped by fear, hierarchy, or deference. The real turning point in global leadership comes when leaders understand that alignment cannot be assumed simply because people confirm they understand. Understanding is cognitive. Alignment is emotional. And in multicultural environments, emotion shapes behavior far more strongly than instruction ever can. When leaders speak, their teams do not respond to what was said, they respond to what the message felt like. This is where most global miscommunication begins, not in misunderstanding, but in emotional misalignment. The leader believes they are providing direction. The team interprets a tone, a level of urgency, a degree of pressure, a hint of expectation. These interpretations diverge silently until the leader begins to see behavioral inconsistency, different speeds, different priorities, different assumptions about boundaries or risk. By the time misalignment becomes visible through outcomes, the emotional drift has already been present for weeks, sometimes months. Leaders often experience this as puzzling inconsistency. I said the same thing to everyone, why is each region doing something different? The answer is not found in the message itself but in the emotional architecture beneath it. The message did not land differently because the words were unclear. It landed differently because the meaning behind the words traveled through different emotional and cultural filters. When leaders realize this, something profound shifts. Communication stops being about transmitting information and becomes about stabilizing interpretation. Tone becomes a strategic tool. Context becomes essential scaffolding. Boundaries become emotional safety mechanisms rather than operational constraints. Urgency becomes something that must be defined, not declared. The leader begins to understand that their role is not to broadcast clarity, but to create an environment in which clarity can survive the emotional and cultural journey it must take. This book begins at that moment, the moment where leadership quietly loses control not because they lacked skill or precision, but because they lacked visibility into the emotional systems that govern global behavior. The chapters that follow reveal how tone, urgency, silence, hierarchy, and cultural instincts reshape meaning long before behavior diverges. They explore why messages multiply emotionally as they cross borders, why interpretation is the true engine of alignment, and how leaders can regain stability not through force or repetition, but through emotional architecture. Global leadership does not fail because of a lack of intelligence or capability. It fails because of a lack of emotional synchronization. And it succeeds when leaders learn to see the invisible moment when meaning begins to shift, the moment the organization stops hearing one message and starts hearing many.